code you'll see on screen during the programme. You can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Conservative commentator Tim Montgomery and journalist and author Christina Patterson. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with the Observer and the ongoing story, this potential ground offensive that could take place in Rafah and the families that are caught up in this, some of them having fled there to safety in the first place and now having to flee again. So it's really drilling down into the human story and the actual individuals that are affected by this, Tim.
Well, so often is the case, Gillian, it's often the photo that speaks more powerfully than the words, and that image of a family fleeing with what have looked like some of the world's sort of most basic things, but probably all they have, in the hope of hitting safety. And I don't think any of us who've seen some of the stuff that's been on social media of late, some of the more heart-rending images of people actually dying, young children dying in our mothers' arms, I saw only quite recently. It's beyond our comprehension what is happening in Rafah, in Gaza. But Israel are determined to plough ahead in a week where really, I think, we've seen one of the most significant international developments in this conflict, with Biden really pulling or potentially pulling some of the key arms supplies to Israel. Having said all I have, and I really mean it, and some of these images have haunted me, I personally can't criticise Israel for doing what it's doing. It's had years with this Hamas terrorist group on its border, committing the kind of outrages that we've seen as on October the 7th. And I wonder, honestly, if Britain had been facing a similar position for decade after decade, whether we would have acted very differently. I can't support what they're doing, but neither can I criticise it. It's just an example when war is just beyond horror. But when you are at war, you take some of the most difficult decisions. I think it's Douglas Murray who said, there is no point putting a fire out 9/10 of a fire. If you don't put all of the fire out, it wasn't worth doing it at all. And what Israel is doing is trying to completely rid their border and the world of their mass terrorist group. But the consequences for innocent people are beyond comprehension.
Just quickly before we go to Christina, do you then think that President Biden was wrong to make the intervention that he did by saying that, he wouldn't be sending more weaponry to Israel because he couldn't support it being used in Rafah?
Personally, I do. And I think, actually, if you look at the sort of 4-year cycle of his presidency, we've seen America abandon Afghanistan. We've seen them, I think, underfund the war in Ukraine. I'm not criticising Biden so much for that. That's more the Republicans in Congress. And now potentially flip-flopping on Israel. You can look at all of those decisions individually, or you conclude overall. What is that saying about America's commitment to its allies in the world? And I think those 3 decisions taken together will have long-term consequences, and very dangerous consequences for the free world.
Christina, what's your view?
Where do I start?
Sorry, a lot there.
Excuse me. I think it's a total tragedy. I mean, you're right, Tim, that photo captures so much, and I think it's impossible to hear and read and see what is happening to these people, these children, these families, and not, one's heart breaks for them. I think that Netanyahu has made his choice. And Biden was absolutely, he's known Netanyahu for years and years. They were close, they were friends, they were allies. America has always been an ally of Israel's, I think, and clearly behind the scenes, Biden has been begging Netanyahu not to go further. My understanding is that America did identify more targeted ways of conducting the war from this point forth, but Netanyahu ignored that, and we have seen the terrible price that is paid. Now, I, from the beginning, have supported Israel's right to defence, because if you have a government, and it is the government of Gaza, committing terrorist acts against you and threatening to annihilate you and still threatening to annihilate you, I think you have no choice but to respond. The question is, how you respond and how you conduct the war. And what has emerged this week is not only that Biden has refused to send weapons, which is an enormous step, but the biggest thing that has emerged is that the report that America has commissioned indicates that what has, I'm afraid, been obvious to pretty much everyone, that Israel has been conducting this war in a way that breaks international humanitarian law. That is really serious. War is a terrible necessity in some situations. If you are invaded, absolutely you have the right to respond, but you have to do that within international law. And it doesn't look as if that's what Netanyahu has been doing. So I think that Netanyahu has decided to go with his right-wingers who are keeping him in power. I suspect that, I mean, I understand, well, I can't understand because I haven't been in that situation, but for every Israeli at the moment, it is absolutely personal. Everybody knows someone who was either taken hostage or killed, or whose relative has been injured or killed. I mean, not very many IDF soldiers have been killed, but many have been injured and some have been killed. It's desperately personal for every Israeli, just as it is for every Palestinian. I think many Israelis would have said, enough already, not enough already, but can we please prioritise the hostages, which is not what Netanyahu has done, and many of them have died by now. And I think...
Well, and there have been protests within Israel.
Absolutely,
So
absolutely.
Overall, though,
point.
I wouldn't defend Netanyahu. I think he shouldn't be the Prime Minister of Israel and may well face very serious corruption trial as soon as he leaves office.
Yes.
But you look at the overall opinion polls, you're both right about the hostages, but the overall, the Israeli opinion still support what he's doing because, and I don't know what we, if my mum had been attacked in some way on October the 7th, and it had been happening, generation after generation.
The guide, Tim, has to be international law, and Israel have apparently been breaking international law. And if you do that, then I'm sorry, but whatever else happens, you lose the PR war, and a whole generation. Nobody wants to see innocent civilians murdered, killed in this way, and if international law is being broken, murdered is the appropriate word. But, entire generations have been politicised by this. So even if he killed every single Hamas soldier, which he won't, none of this is going to increase Israel's security in the long term. It leaves them, it has politicised and enraged not only a generation, but all the Palestinians.
We'll stay with Israel, just move on, because we've only seen, I think, one paper, and this is Israel via the Eurovision Song Contest, which is taking place this evening. And the Israeli singer, Eden Golan, there were protests before she performed. She had a mixed response, some people booing at the start of her performance. Do you believe that she should be allowed to take part in the competition, Tim?
There's always difficult debates, aren't there, when you have a Russian artist or someone else involved in a conflict. Where do we, like it's true in sport as well, with things like the Olympics. I don't know exactly what the view on that. Personally, I have a lot more sympathy with Israel, so I wouldn't ban them. But I understand those that take a different view, because I would not want Russia involved, for example, in the Olympics or Eurovision at the moment. But just putting the politics aside for a minute, you see some of the threats made to this woman on the streets of Sweden. Some of the stuff on social media is beyond comprehension. All I would say is she's an artist, and I just think probably one of the bravest women in Europe at the moment to put up, because there's plenty of people who will not forgive or forget her face, and I wonder whether she will have to have security for many years to come now.
Yes, security details very heavy around her indeed.
Yeah.
We've only got about a minute left, but the Times, they're looking at the climate activist Greta Thunberg, who's obviously been protesting outside Eurovision. What's your thoughts on that, Christina?
Well, I'm half Swedish, and my mother's family come from southern Sweden, and I was in Malmö, spent some time in Malmö a couple of years ago. I mean, I have to say, these days, I'm not a massive fan of Greta Thunberg. I sort of feel like wherever there is trouble, she is there. Of course, what she's done in terms of climate, kind of her protests on the climate front have been very impressive. But the whole of Malmö is pretty much protesting. Malmö has an enormous immigrant population, much of it from the Middle East, much of it is from Syria, Iraq, and Ethiopia and Eritrea and so on, and most of those people are very, very pro-Palestinian. So I feel like it's not really necessary for her to do this protesting. But, you know, clearly I absolutely understand why people feel strongly about it. Of course I do. And of course we should protest that children are being killed. But what I don't support is people walking on marches where people essentially are calling for the annihilation of Israel. If you have slogans saying from the river to the sea and people are saying very much worse than that, that is a genocidal slogan.
Absolutely.
And so I'm not in favour of people who associate themselves with people who... And that is not just anti-Semitic, it is genocidal.
Tim?
Well, I agree. And there was a Liberal Democrat in Liverpool. It was quite, don't know if you saw it, captured on social media in the last few days. And he said he criticised what Israel was doing in Palestine. But then, when he criticised what Hamas had done on October the 7th, he was shouted down. And that's part of the problem.
Exactly.
Criticising Israel is fine. That's absolutely right. But when you have people on the streets of England or on the streets of Sweden defending Hamas, I worry a great deal about that.
Yeah, I just wish some of these people would also protest against Hamas.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Christina and Tim, for the moment, thank you. We're going to take a break. Coming up, a crackdown on so-called woke diversity jobs in Whitehall. That story in tomorrow's Telegraph. We'll discuss that and others when we come back. Do stay with us.
As you say, it is not the typical dream for a teenage girl. I think the simplest explanation is that I was a really naughty teenager. I got myself in a lot of trouble and I earned myself a reputation. And for years, I fought between trying to live up to that reputation and trying to lose that reputation. And it wasn't until this incredible teacher came along and he saw something in me and he decided to fight for me. And it was him fighting for me that sort of redefined something in me. It made me not someone that everyone had given up on, but someone was worth fighting for. The sort of violent and chaotic and hectic side to prison life is really well documented. And that was a big reason why I wrote The Prison Officer, because I really wanted to share the bits in between that and the conversations that I had with people, the incredibly ordinary and interesting conversations that I had with prisoners. I think one of my favourite examples of that was a man called Domingo, who was an infamous drill artist, was heavily gang involved, and he arrived on the wing, and I probably had similar expectations of him as anyone else would. He sang violent lyrics about the crimes that he committed, and what I actually found with him is that we ended up talking for hours on end about philosophy and horoscopes. He was fascinated in them. I really hope that my book tells the different side to prison that makes people interested in joining the service, because I loved it as a job. And you talk about more training, but no amount of sitting in a classroom can prepare you for stepping onto that wing. And in the early days of my book, I speak about my first experiences on the wing, and I've got no idea what's going on. I feel so watched, partly because that's the way that a prison wing is laid out, and partly because those prisoners are watching you for every move. They're trying to figure out what type of person you are. I ended up catching tuberculosis whilst I was a prison officer. Unfortunately, infectious diseases are rife in prison because lots of people living in cramped conditions is a perfect storm for that kind of thing. And I became really ill, and I ended up spending a year recovering from tuberculosis. And I think that that's an interesting thing that people often don't think about. When you lose your liberty, you also often lose your right to health.
Welcome back. You are watching the Press Preview, still with me, Conservative commentator Tim Montgomery and journalist and author Christina Patterson. Let's have a look at the Mail and this story regarding Natalie Elphicke. Take us into it, Christina. Explain.
Oh, dear. Well, it's all kicking off, is the summary. Basically, everyone who's ever met her now in the Tory party, they're all absolutely furious, understandably, that she's defected to Labour. So now everybody who was perfectly happy to be complicit with all the things she did wrong for however long she did them is now crawling out of the woodwork and saying, oh, my goodness, she did all these things wrong. I mean, she did do some pretty awful things. I think, I can't say I've ever been a fan of hers. I think her supporting her husband, who was convicted by the law of the land for the sexual offences he was convicted of, and essentially blaming the victims, which she did, was not her finest.
But she has apologised for that,
She has apologised for, but, you know, I'm sure that she didn't apologise until this week. So that's a bit weird, isn't it? And now there are various stories saying that she was offered... She was furious because she wasn't offered this job as housing minister, which she really wanted. She's there, and Robert Buckland is now saying that she basically tried to enlist his help in the legal case, her husband's legal case. So I think the timing, I mean, a sceptic might say, or that, you know, it's a little bit cynical that the Tories are now coming out. But the big question is, should Labour have accepted her? And I understand, I think it's backfiring. I understand why Keir Starmer felt it was useful to have a right-wing Tory who is in Dover on the front line of the boats crisis in the big tent of the kind of Labour Party that he wants to establish and get into power. But I think to have accepted someone with apparently so little integrity, who, if she did ask Robert Buckland to interfere, and he says she did, then, which he denies, but he says she did, and I think I would believe Robert Buckland over her, that is a very, very serious thing to do. So I think it's not looking good, actually.
Just to bringing some response for her, the spokesman for her has said that there's a quote, "This is nonsense. It's certainly true that Mr Elphicke continued to be supported after his imprisonment by a large number of Conservative MPs who'd known him for a long time, including some who visited him independently and lobbied on his behalf, which has nothing to do with Natalie." And another quote, if Robert Buckland had any genuine concerns about the meeting, then he should have raised them at the time rather than making claims to the newspapers. Now Natalie has chosen to join the Labour Party.
Well, look, I don't think I'm a Conservative supporter. I don't think it reflects particularly well on some of the Conservatives that they are only talking about these issues now. But I do happen to know the story about that Robert Buckland has alleged. I didn't know anything about that. Actually, the story that's on the front of The Observer about that Natalie Elphicke was making it very clear for quite a while she was very unhappy about not getting a ministerial job. I'd heard that well before the defection. She wasn't hiding her unhappiness. At first, Liz Truss, not even Liz Truss would give her a job in that administration, and she didn't get one under Rishi Sunak either. And I don't know, it's very interesting, really. There is quite a traffic of Conservative MPs to Labour, but not the other way around over the many years. And I think part of the explanation is if you just toss up the number of years the Conservatives have been in power since the war, it's sort of like 2/3 of the time. Yeah. And I think that means that my party does occasionally get more than its fair share of people who are perhaps more interested in career and opportunism than ideology. And I'm not necessarily saying that's true of Natalie Elphicke, but I think when you try and look at why this keeps happening, when the going gets tough for the Conservative Party, we do seem to have quite a few people who jump ship, and I'm not sure it's always on the highest of principle.
I think the comment is some may think that, but you couldn't...
Exactly.
comment.
I need you as my agent.
We've just got time to talk about diversity roles being scrapped by the civil service, Christina. They're ejecting the wokeism of D&I.
Yeah, I wish the word woke could be banned, actually.
No, I actually have banned it from this show, but I'm only using it because it was...
Breaking your own rules.
I know.
Good for you, Gillian, because it's become a kind of, this is how we signal that we're kind of, anti-nonsense. And I am passionately committed to diversity, proper diversity, which, for example, includes combating ageism, which is a very big issue now. But I do think, and I wouldn't want to say without knowing more about this, but I do think that, for example, the kind of Stonewall propaganda machine that kicked in and took over so many of the institutions in this country, including the civil service, with totally facile and unscientific ideologies about gender, has been seriously dangerous and a terrible mistake.
Christina, we must leave it there.
I have a whole PhD piece.
And I'm raring to come back on something.
We're running out of time. You have to save it for the next hour. Thank you so much for the moment. Coming up next on Sky News 11, Sky News witnesses firsthand the ferocity of the fighting in the east of Ukraine after Russia's surprise offensive near the city of Kharkiv. This is Sky News at 11 o'clock. The headlines this evening. The stark reality of Russia's new offensive. Sky News witnesses its harsh impact on life in eastern Ukraine.
We can hear explosions. There's clearly a battle going on the outskirts, and clearly this town is still under attack.
Leave now. Israel's warning to tens of thousands more Palestinians to leave the city of Rafah ahead of a potential full-scale assault. Also ahead. Israel's finalist Eden Golan takes to the stage at Eurovision, triggering a mixed response from the crowd. While outside the venue, pro-Palestine demonstrators clash with Swedish police in response to Israel's inclusion in the competition. Close to 50,000 people take to the streets of Georgia in the country's biggest protests against laws that critics say threaten free speech. Plus, did you see it? The super solar storm that brought the Northern Lights to the UK. And we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages in our press preview from 11:30. Good evening. We begin with the stark realities of war facing millions of people in Ukraine. Sky News has seen and heard firsthand the ferocity of the fighting in the east of the country after Russia's surprise offensive near the city of Kharkiv. Many of the residents of a nearby town want to flee, and our team saw the impact of a bomb which hit a residential block, setting it on fire. Russia says its troops have taken 5 villages, and the Kharkiv region's governor says they're trying to take more as fierce fighting continues. Russian forces have so far launched 2 limited advances in the area, one north of Kharkiv city and one near Vovchansk, with civilians being evacuated. Our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, is in Vovchansk and sent this report. And a warning, it includes pictures of the injury suffered by one resident.
The reality of life under Russian fire. A huge blast shattered this residential block. No sign